Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us for the Committee on Environment and Sustainability's 2021 webinar series. This is the last webinar in our series, and it will feature the Cultural Resources Subcommittee. And like I said, this is the last one. So we'll have the recordings and materials available on the committee's website as soon as we are able after this event as well. So first, I just want to tell you a couple of things about the platform. So we're using the Zoom webinar platform. It's fairly similar to the Zoom meeting platform, but there are a couple differences. So if you look at the bottom of your screen, you'll see that there's both a Q&A box and a chat box. Feel free to put your thoughts in the chat. We'll be monitoring that as well. But if you have questions for our speakers, please put them in the Q&A box. That will allow us to keep track of the questions that come in amongst the chatter in the chat. And also, if we run over on time, our panelists can answer those by typing answers as well. They don't have to answer them out loud. So again, feel free to put your thoughts in the chat, but please put your questions in the Q&A box. I think that about covers it. So I'll pull up our agenda for today, and Tony, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, Phil. Good morning to our friends in the West, and good afternoon to our colleagues in the East. Welcome to the final annual meeting session for AASHTO's Committee on Environment and Sustainability, or CES. I hope some of you may have joined us for our other Thursday sessions this past month involving environmental process, natural resources, and air quality. And I'm confident that you'll find this session interesting, informative, and lively. I'm Tony Opperman, Chair of the Cultural Resources Subcommittee of AASHTO's Committee on Environment and Sustainability. And my day job is the Cultural Resources Program Manager for the Virginia Department of Transportation. Cultural resource issues involving the built environment of the late 20th century have been an important topic in our monthly subcommittee calls over the last few years. However, those issues were significant over a decade ago as the quantities of buildings began to increase exponentially. And that was the basis for NCHRP Report 723, a model for identifying and evaluating the historic significance of post-World War II housing, published in 2012. Of note is that Report 723 was, at one time, the single most downloaded publication published by NCHRP, and that's the single most downloaded publication out of hundreds. Its inclusion in this program reflects its continued importance almost a decade after publication, and that the underlying problem hasn't gone away. Since then, the quantities of resources have continued to increase and pose significant challenges to transportation project development across the US, as well as challenges to our SHPO partners. I've heard many of my colleagues say, we've got to start doing something different than what we're doing now. The importance of this topic led the Cultural Resources Subcommittee to devote the entirety of our portion of the CES annual meeting to taking a deeper dive into issues involving the late 20th century built environment, and especially to get a sense of how the problem is being handled among a cross-section of DOTs. First, we'll hear federal perspectives on this topic from our colleagues at the Federal Highway Administration, the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation, and the Keeper's Office of the National Park Service. After that, we'll be provided a review and case study of the application of NCHRP 723 from two of that study's authors from Mead and Hunt. Then, following a break, Scott Williams with the Washington DOT will lead a lightning round and find out how 9 state DOTs are managing their populations of late 20th century resources in project development. And finally, after the lightning round, Sigrid Berglund with the Michigan DOT and Subcommittee Vice Chair will have closing remarks. Before we move to our federal colleagues, I want to offer a hearty welcome to Gail Davino, former chair of the subcommittee, now recently retired from the Georgia DOT, and my very good friend. Gail, if we were meeting in person, I'd have you stand up and take a round of applause. So without further ado, I'm passing the baton to David Clark, Federal Preservation Officer for the Federal Highway Administration, to lead a federal perspective on our focus topic. Take it away, David.
Thank you, Tony. Good morning and good afternoon, everybody. As Tony said, my name is David Clark. I'm the Federal Preservation officer at the Federal Highway Administration. And I'm going to talk a little bit about this topic and then introduce our liaison at the Advisory Council. The Federal Highway Administration's perspective in terms of our compliance with Section 106 of the regulations is that, if historic properties meet the 50-year threshold mark, they need to be looked at. So it's from a 106 standpoint, nothing changes in our purview of how the Federal Highway Administration perceives mid-20th century architecture. You still have to consider it. That being said, the sheer quantity of properties from this time period is staggering. And I'll be interested to hear more from our state DOT counterparts in terms of how they're unpacking solutions to what is becoming more and more of a challenge on large-scale linear transportation projects. I've heard from across the country and our colleagues that there are many state DOTs working with their SHPO offices on historic context solutions to grasp and grapple with this resource. Like many other historic properties, they're quite variable, and these resources may look very different in Arizona than they do in New Hampshire. That being said, during this time period in the post-World War II suburbanization of the United States, there are some similarities from a contextual standpoint, and the NCHRP report 723 did a really good job at beginning the process to unpack this topic and to really dive into it. I'm extremely excited about the new NCHRP report that will be forthcoming on commercial properties from this time period. And these two products are meant to work together or go hand in hand. And the Federal Highway Administration definitely supports the NCHRP program and these research products that are put out. I'm very excited about this new product and hope it will help the industry as we grasp with this topic. A few of the things that I'm seeing nationally from a federal perspective are that there does seem to be a challenge with subject matter expertise in regards to this type of architecture. And by that, I mean, grad schools are not pumping out architectural historians with a focus on mid-20th century or even late 20th century architecture. And there are many places where it's a struggle within the DOT consultants and in the SHPO office to have that type of architectural expertise to determine, if these properties may even be eligible under criteria A, B, C, or D. So when we progress in time and, we having to start look at historic architecture from the 60s, the 1970s, the 1980s, we're getting into more recent time periods with quote unquote more recent architecture. And some things that I'm starting to see because of this challenge in subject matter expertise is a number of state DOTs are actually kind of going back to a tried and true method that was prominent in the 1980s of partnering up with universities again and colleges to assist in their state with looking at these property types or having subject matter expertise at a state level for this type of architecture. So that's something that I feel like we may see some more of, as well as leveraging potentially state universities and colleges to assist with, how that state wants to handle this architecture from this time period. And by that, I mean, I'm seeing some states take advantage of having graduate students do master's theses on this topic and then provide that research to the SHPO office, and the state DOD can take advantage of that for that state. So I think we're going to see some more of that, as well as in the consultant services, GIS with these types of properties can be a really, really great way. And I'm seeing some very innovative consultant services with consultants that are utilizing GIS capabilities to map the sheer quantity of these properties and doing things with windshield surveys that are highly productive, efficient, and can be cost effective. So on the consultant side, I would really focus and look to, the GIS capabilities that can assist and help with, identifying these types of historic properties, and then also with potentially, working through eligibility determinations and effect findings. This is a challenging topic. This is not an easy one, and it's only going to get more complicated again as we begin looking at historic architectural properties from the 1970s, 1980s, and even more recent. And the stance and the policy that the Federal Highway Administration has is that the regulations still work for us for these types of historic properties. We just have to be creative in our implementation of the regulations in terms of finding those solutions that will help unpack this historic property type. So the Federal Highway Administration is not in a place to advocate for program alternatives or any change from a regulatory standpoint. We feel that we're able to implement the regulations as written, even for the sheer quantity of this challenging property type. We just have to, again, kind of be creative in our solutions to do that. And that's where I'm seeing some new tactics across the country, as well as even just, having a historic context of this property type in a state can be very productive, and working through the minutia with the SHPO office and other consulting parties to determine what's best within the confines of the state you're working in. And knowing that through venues like this, TRB, other venues, and consultant services, because consultants work all over the country, we're seeing some new innovative approaches on how to address this property type and still comply with the regulations. I want to thank everyone for inviting me today, and that I will be listening in, and I'm more than willing to take questions if they come up on this topic. And I'd like to introduce Mandy Ranslow, who's our liaison at the Advisory Council, to go next. You're on mute, Mandy. You win. Someone.
What a rookie mistake. Oh my God. Okay. Let's try this over again. Good morning, good afternoon. My name is Mandy Ranslow. I'm the Fed Highway Liaison at the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation. And like you all, I am really looking forward to today's presentation on post-World War II resources. I think most of you on here know, but just in case there's some that don't, the ACHP, the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation, we're a federal agency that oversees the Federal Historic Preservation Review process that was established by Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act. Section 106 requires federal agencies to consider the effects of their projects carried out by them or subject to assistance or approval on historic properties, and provide the ACHP an opportunity to comment on these projects prior to a final decision on them. In regards to, specifically post-World War II resources from the ACHP's perspective, we encourage and expect consideration of any potentially eligible historic property under 106. So, we understand that there are certainly challenges in evaluating these properties that might be so ordinary or ubiquitous. However, the ACHP does expect federal agencies to make a reasonable and good faith effort to identify, evaluate, and assess the effect to eligible or listed properties that could be impacted by their undertaking. There's no special provisions in the 106 regs for recent historic properties, so our expectation is that they be considered in the consultation process along with any of our older historic properties that we're looking at. While eligibility is really more the purview is the purview of the National Park Service, the ACHP is available to offer technical assistance when needed. And I certainly would encourage you, like David's already mentioned, to use resources that are already available, like the NCHRP study on post-World War II housing. I know some states already have some context developed, and I think there's discussion of at least one of those later. And then the forthcoming NCHRP report on commercial properties that's also going to be discussed later in the session is something that I'm certainly really excited about. So I guess I'll just, keep it short by saying, reach out to me if you have any 106 procedural questions, like if it looks like you're headed toward an effect dispute, or if you just have a really large undertaking with numerous post-World War II resources in your area of potential effect, and you might, want to see some best practice examples. There are certainly some states dealing with this now. So, I'm happy to help if you have any tricky questions about those types of projects, either later, or I'm certainly going to be sticking around today to listen in on the rest of the session so I can answer questions later as well. So I will turn it over to Jim Gabbert. He is an historian with the National Park Service's National Register Program. Thanks.
Thank you, Mandy. I'm happy to be here. My role at the National Register of Historic Places is a reviewer. I have 15 states and territories, many of whom are represented in the lightning round today, that I'm responsible for reviewing nominations for. So the focus of this panel is mostly on Section 106 and coming to determinations of eligibility under 106. Working for the Keeper's Office, we're only involved in an instance where there is a dispute between the federal agency and the SHPO on eligibility. Then that kicks it to 36 CFR Part 63 regulations, where the keeper gets the final decision on what is eligible and what is not. So we're not involved in the day-to-day struggle of how do we deal with all of these resources. Now, as of the agency and the program that basically sets the baseline for what is eligible and what isn't eligible, we try to be responsive to what's happening out in the greater world, but it's hard to do that in this wonderful world of limited budgets, limited personnel, for us to continually update guidance. And we've had a 4-year moratorium on guidance that we're now over, and are hoping to issue some guidance we had been working on prior to this that may or may not have any impact on this discussion. But the Traditional Cultural Properties Bulletin will hopefully be coming out for review very soon. And we are looking on updating Bulletin 16, the how-to series. But that being said, there is some guidance that can be helpful. The Historic Suburbs Bulletin, which doesn't really reach into the post-war era, but still has good ideas about how to look at suburban developments more holistically, rather than focused entirely on architecture. Now, I got to concur with David at Federal Highways that one of the issues facing us is there aren't that many subject matter experts on post-World War II, and especially more contemporary 1970s, 1980s architecture. There isn't a lot of literature out there. Another aspect that I see from my perspective is that there is an overemphasis on the architecture aspect, the design of individual resources and their importance. While that is one of the 4 criteria and the most popular, it's almost become the default criterion for making evaluations under Section 106. Looking at how the country overall developed in the post-war era, especially as it's influenced by improvements and changes in transportation, we need to look more at criterion A significance as these larger developments occur, especially residential developments, and their impact on the landscape and geography of any particular area. And this might be something that is worth visiting for an updated historic suburbs bulletin, is looking at the post-World War II era and its effect on the cultural landscape. So I'm here to answer questions, hopefully. I'm here to suggest, as David said, that partnering with universities to develop context, to develop survey methodologies, to utilize GIS as it's a wonderful tool for looking at development patterns, and to use the publications, including the forthcoming one that's coming out on commercial properties as a basis for evaluation, is entirely valid, absent any specific direction that comes out of the keeper's office, which right now is probably not going to happen very soon. So I think that's really all I've got for you now, but I am here to hopefully answer some questions. Okay, I'm looking at some of the chats here. Wow, there's a lot. I have to work backwards. Have there been any keeper disputes about 1960s or later resources? The reality is we don't get that many formal determination of eligibility questions. So yes, there have been disputes over specific resources, not necessarily any that I can come up with from my states that involve Federal Highway Administration. We've had a couple with the FAA, but right now, I would say that they're rare. It seems to me that a lot of the states are working out some consensus. Now, we did have one here in Virginia, outside or within the community of Reston, that involved some 1960s and even into the 1970s resources where there was a dispute, and the real dispute revolved around criteria consideration G and what constitutes exceptional significance. And one of the issues is in applying criteria consideration G, one of the common mistakes that we have is ignoring local significance. What is exceptionally important within a local community versus that larger state or national perspective. By far, most properties that are eligible at the local level, and therefore, by extension, there are going to be properties that are of exceptional importance within a local community. In this case, the town of Reston, as a planned community and one of the very first wholly planned communities in the country, the components of that plan, while they in and of themselves may not be of exceptional importance, relate to the overall exceptional importance of the plan as a whole. And I can't go into great detail about Reston right now, but that is one that we have worked on.
Yeah, and Jim, I just wanted to say, I do know the one in Virginia, and I was thinking that's the only one that the Federal Highway Administration recently has gone to the keeper, is the Virginia example. For the rest of the country, most of the ones that come to me, I'm able to resolve them working with our state partners in the SHPO office. So it is very rare. That's the only one that I know of is in Virginia. I've looked at a lot of them, but we've been able to resolve the dispute with the SHPO.
Yeah, and we're happy that you do that, because the fewer DOEs I have to look at, the happier I am. Are there any regular NRHP nominations of consequence that have been acted on by the keeper? I'm not really sure how to answer that. Of consequence, what is of consequence? If we're dealing with post-World War II development, yes, we have been seeing a big increase in residential historic neighborhoods from the 60s in particular, some of them bleeding into the 1970s. And these are coming from across the country. There's not one state that is ahead of any others. And we are also getting lots of individual criterion C type nominations for individual homes from the 1960s. So that's been a very hot topic for the SHPOs lately, is hitting their stride in post-World War II, especially modernist architecture or really high quality contemporary ranch or that type subdivisions. Well, I've got a question. Is there any additional information you can give us about the replacement siding guidance that has come out from the keeper? The keeper has not issued any such guidance. The Park Service, through Technical Preservation Services, has. They're the folks who maintain the Secretary of Interior standards, as well as administer the federal investment tax program. The National Park Service Keeper's Office has always been fairly straightforward on newer siding on resources. So in terms of historic districts, we have seen many historic districts that have utilized or have allowed for the addition of aluminum, vinyl, steel, other types of artificial or newer siding on properties that can still be considered contributing. What we ask for in any nomination that deals with siding like that is that in Section 7, in the integrity analysis, they explain their thinking behind it. What are the characteristics that must still be retained in order for any building that has second or even third generation siding on it to still contribute to a district? When it comes to individual properties, it depends on the criterion that the property is nominated under. There are 7 aspects of integrity, and they're not all equal, and they're not all judged the same for the 4 different criteria, or really 3 different criteria we typically use for buildings. So when you're evaluating a property for its architectural significance, obviously materials is an important aspect of that evaluation. If you're evaluating it under criterion A for events that are associated with it, the physical materials may not be as important. So the changes to the exterior in terms of materials may not impact the overall historic integrity as much as changes to the interior, where the event occurred or where this significant person lived, acted, and did whatever it was that they were significant for. So the guidance that you may refer to is not necessarily the keeper's guidance. What years are being used to define post-World War II? Personally, I would take it up to 1970. I think that you really see a change in building construction techniques, development aspects in the late 60s, early 70s that do mark a change in especially residential development and methods of development, and in terms of commercial architecture, the changes to the tax code that made it more beneficial to property owners to build in certain ways based on depreciation of the buildings, changed the physical look of our environment and how buildings looked in the post-1960s era. All right, I don't know if I can keep up with all the questions here, but I'd be happy to try. Or if someone else wants to jump in, like David.
Yeah, I just wanted to say one thing on your last point, Jim. In terms of how we define the time period of post-World War II, I completely agree with you that in the 1970s, there is this big shift in architecture. However, I think this topic is still a little unresolved nationally. I've seen it be a little inconsistent in some places where in Southern California, it's maybe a little different than in Rhode Island. It's different maybe in Alaska versus Florida regionally on some of these architectural styles of what's happening. Is it 70 or up to 1980? So I think, I'm in a place where, I want to provide the maximum flexibility to our state partners in that regard. So I would say the time periods, I don't think there's a nationally consistent standard yet. And I think as we do more work in architectural history on stuff from the 60s and 70s, we may have a more concise agreement. But right now, I've seen a lot of different date ranges. And in the new NCHRP study for commercial properties, we struggled with this exact question. We really did. And it's maybe something when Mead and Hunt talks about it, they can also address how we struggled with that on the panel, trying to come to consensus.
Yeah, it's very hard to, a term like post-World War II or post-war is so amorphous. And I think it is that analysis of the built environment and what changes that are evident from one period to another, not just in terms of architectural style, but in method of construction, financing, the rise and professionalization of zoning, all of which has an effect on our built environment. And those were gradual changes in some areas, and they were more abrupt in others.
Anything else in the chat, but I do see a hand up. So I see that Mary Catherine Murray has her hand up, so I'm just gonna unmute her or allow you to talk, and then you can unmute yourself and ask your question, Mary Catherine.
I'm so sorry, that was accidental.
Okay, perfect.
Thank you.
In the world of the keeper, I come from a slightly different perspective than some of my colleagues because I did work in an SHPO. And I worked both as a National Register, but also as a survey coordinator. And I also reviewed everything above ground for eligibility. So I understand that the struggle that SHPOs have in not only keeping up with just the sheer volume of 106 that comes in on limited staffs, but also how the flat funding of the HPF has meant that there is not an emphasis on survey anymore. A lot of the survey is done purely out of compliance issues, that they don't have the funding or opportunity to do more holistic and comprehensive survey programs. And as David pointed out, the sheer number of resources from this era of the 1960s, 70s and into the 80s is astronomical and daunting. And any survey program that does not take into account things that are 30 years old or even 25 years old becomes obsolete very quickly. So, I cut my teeth doing surveys where we used 45 years as the cutoff, which meant by the time the survey was done, it was virtually obsolete because it doesn't take into account the stuff that is coming right on the edge. And since survey and the National Register are supposed to be planning tools, one needs to look ahead as well. That's my soapbox.
All right, do we have any other questions before we move on to our next? Okay, so Emily and Christina, if you guys are ready to go, we can move on to your section.
Jen, let me say a few words to
Yeah.
introduce Emily and Christina. And thank you, David, Mandy, and Jim. It was really interesting. NCHRP report 723 and I go way back. I was one of several authors of the original problem statement that got submitted to NCHRP at least twice before it was selected for funding. From an NCHRP perspective, report 723 would be described as a large scope, multi-year study in contrast to small scope, short duration studies or syntheses. It's had considerable impact in our community, and I'm pleased to introduce two of its authors. Emily Pettis is the Cultural Resources Department Manager for Mead and Hunt Incorporated and the lead author of NCHRP 723. She's also past chair of TRB's ADC 50 Committee on Historic and Archaeological Preservation and Transportation, now rebranded as AME 60. Emily is joined by Christina Slattery, the Cultural Resources Business Unit Leader for Mead and Hunt Incorporated, and a co-author of NCHRP 723. So Emily and Christina, the virtual podium is yours.
Thank you, Tony. Good afternoon or morning, everybody. As Tony mentioned, I'm Emily Pettis with Mead and Hunt. And today my colleague Christina Slattery and I are presenting on our findings regarding the evaluation of post-war residential properties and providing a preview of our upcoming NCHRP project that we're leading that focuses on post-war commercial properties. As DOTs and preservation professionals, we all understand that post-war property types provide us with many challenges when it comes to consideration of these resources under Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act. The challenges range from the sheer volume of post-war houses and commercial buildings that were constructed, the seemingly similar history, and the ubiquitous design. As we've already discussed, there's also a lack of guidance and various approaches on how to identify which of these properties stand out amongst others and possess significance and eligibility for the National Register. Mead and Hunt is involved with two NCHRP studies that have the goal of addressing challenges of these post-war property types and specifically aid DOTs in compliance with Section 106. The first is NCHRP Report 723, a model for identifying and evaluating the historic significance of post-World War II housing, which we'll outline today, highlighting the guidance it provides and presenting a case study on its application to a Section 106 compliance project. The second NCHRP study, currently called Project 2562, will provide guidance on evaluating post-war commercial properties. We'll provide an introduction to this ongoing study at the end of the presentation. While many of you may be familiar with NCHRP Report 723, we'd like to provide a refresher on the content. This may also be beneficial for newer agency staff who've come on board since the report was initially completed. This residential study focuses on houses built from 1946 to 1975. The study was undertaken to assist DOTs, SHPOs, TIPOs, and preservation professionals by developing a model for the survey and evaluation of both individual homes and subdivisions, providing methods to streamline post-war residential surveys, since a large number of resources and time are dedicated when traditional survey methods are applied, and providing greater consistency for National Register evaluations under Section 106. A major component of the project was the development of a national historic context, which presents a succinct history of the overall trends and influences on housing of this period, some of which are illustrated here. Before this study, the absence of contextual information presented a significant challenge to cultural resource professionals seeking to evaluate the National Register eligibility for both individual post-war houses and districts comprised of subdivisions. This national historic context addresses significant themes of the era, including transportation trends, which were strongly influenced by the construction of the interstate and other freeways that contributed to suburban development nationwide. Government programs and policies also influenced residential development, such as Federal Housing Administration standards and the Servicemen's Readjustment Act, also known as the GI Bill. Social, economic, and cultural trends are also evident in post-war home layouts, as homemakers had a greater say in the design of living space, as evidenced here by the convenient television placement above the oven. To address the ubiquity of vernacular post-war housing and the general absence of standard stylistic nomenclature, the context provides a detailed explanation of the popular styles and forms of the post-war period, including the minimal traditional, Cape Cod, colonial revival, ranch, and split level, as well as prefabricated homes such as the Lustron. Overall, the national context provides the following benefits. It allows for understanding of themes related to post-war development. It provides an appropriate framework in which to place local resources and neighborhoods as they're evaluated on a project-by-project basis, and it serves as a guide for development of local and regional contexts. The next main component of the study is the survey methodology. Standard survey methodologies employed by many state DOTs require documentation of each resource within a project's area of potential effects that meet an age requirement, typically those constructed between 40 and 50 years ago. This proves vexing for the large number of post-war properties that are coming of age and require consideration for transportation projects. Following these standard practices, cultural resource and transportation professionals often expend project time and budget surveying and documenting a large number of sometimes nearly identical resources. To remedy this, a survey methodology was developed that provides streamlined measures for the survey and documentation of post-war resources as a collection, as well as minimum criteria for the survey of individual residences. This is intended to provide an efficient process that eliminates documentation of large numbers of similar properties, and it allows for consistency across states and geographic areas. Although the requirements for survey documentation standards vary from state to state, the methodology focuses on the appropriate and needed level of documentation for ubiquitous post-war residential resources, and it's tailored to address their specific eligibility evaluation. To streamline the survey and documentation process, concentrations of similar properties identified during preliminary research and field survey efforts should be documented as a group rather than individual resources, since they're recommended to be evaluated collectively as a potential historic district. Depending on the number of resources in the project area, a group could be limited to a single block, or it could be as large as an entire subdivision. Tools such as plat maps, aerial photos, tax parcel data, and GIS can assist with the identification of these groupings and the delineation of neighborhood and subdivision boundaries for survey and subsequent evaluation purposes. The other component of the survey methodology is selective survey for individual properties. This should be used when the grouping approach is not applicable. Due to the sheer volume of post-war single-family residences, it's not typically practical or prudent to employ traditional survey methodologies, which can require the field survey and documentation of numerous similar houses, many of which have few distinguishing features or display significant alterations. This selective approach allows for a streamlined identification process by documenting only those examples of post-war residences that retain a degree of integrity and display character-defining features and architectural elements, thereby having the potential to be eligible for the National Register. Use of this approach eliminates blanket documentation of numerous resources that don't display historic integrity or characteristic features. The next component is the evaluation guidance, which provides a framework for evaluating the significance of individual properties in historic districts under criteria A and C. The guidance presented is specific to post-war houses, and its framework is based on the National Register criteria and related bulletins. The report presents the method by which properties are evaluated against the National Register criteria, resulting in an eligibility recommendation. If an individual house or district conveys significance under the criteria and retains historic integrity, it's considered eligible for the National Register. This survey and evaluation methodology is beneficial to DOTs and practitioners. It provides methods to streamline the survey and evaluation process. It's applicable to post-war resources nationally, and it provides an opportunity for greater consistency between states and agencies. Since its initial publication, the report has had widespread application. As Tony mentioned, it's one of the most downloaded TRB reports, which demonstrates its appeal and use. Some DOTs and SHPOs have adopted the survey and evaluation methodology, while other states have adopted portions or use it to supplement their own guidance. And practitioners find value in the national context, illustrated architectural forms and styles of the period, and the illustrated examples of eligibility and integrity. Mead and Hunt has successfully applied this methodology to Section 106 projects, and Christina will now discuss one such example.
Great. So the case study I'm going to talk about today is how the methodology was successfully applied to a Section 106 project in Nevada. The project is the US 395 I-580 interchange in Reno, known locally as the Spaghetti Bowl. And you can see here that the network of roads that form that Spaghetti Bowl occupy a substantial footprint. In advance, go to the next slide, Emily, please. In advance of a proposed improvement project, the Nevada DOT recognized that the project would need to identify and evaluate several post-World War II residential subdivisions. The APE, shown as the red box on the map here, contained more than 1,400 properties, including more than 650 single-family residences in several post-war subdivisions. And you can see, based on the coloring of construction dates, the age range of most of the properties within the APE date to the 1950s and 60s. And this kind of heat map, as we call it, was prepared in GIS, which has been talked about as a great tool for this property type. And it really provides a quick, great snapshot of the construction dates of the survey area and beyond. A traditional survey approach in Nevada would have required individual documentation and evaluation of each property for the National Register of Historic Places. And this level of effort would have been a big undertaking and a disproportionately high level of effort given the relative uniformity of architectural styles of the post-war residences and the similar historic context that they share. To address this challenge, the DOT and the SHPO agreed early on to use the methodology and documentation recommendations in the NCHRP research report. The study's national context, as Emily discussed, establishes significant national trends and influences, and therefore offered an existing framework within which the project team could situate Reno in its regional context and identify local trends. The methodology also provided a framework to streamline survey and documentation efforts for the subdivisions. So the Silverado subdivision is one example of the application of this streamlined documentation. Located at the northwest quadrant of the interchange, the 50-acre subdivision is the largest cohesive residential development within the APE, containing 244 single-family homes constructed between 1960 and 1965. Representative housing stock in the subdivision is seen here. And the project team documented the subdivision as a district on a single inventory form that was eventually submitted to the Nevada State Historic Preservation Office. In order to document the subdivision, the survey team completed 2 windshield surveys. The first was undertaken to drive each street of the subdivision to record general impressions and prepare simple sketches of the district's representative housing types within it. On this initial survey, it was identified that the houses generally conformed to one of 6 types shown here. On a second drive-through of the subdivision, surveyors recorded the housing type for each parcel, in addition to noting major alterations to assist with future assessment of integrity. Representative photographs were also taken of examples of each of the house types, as well as overviews within the subdivision. The property types were mapped, and you can see the distribution of the housing types on the map here. In addition to the mapping of the housing types, documentation for the district included a table of addresses for properties, maps showing the construction date, and the representative photographs that I mentioned that were taken on the windshield survey. This documentation by property type was sufficient to establish the defining characteristics of the subdivision as a whole and served as a basis for preparation of a single district inventory form for the subdivision as its evaluation as a historic district. The application of the guidance provided by the NCHRP report resulted in substantial savings of time and effort. First, relying on the national context, project historians were able to focus their research and context on efforts to outline local and regional trends in order to understand how the subdivisions in the spaghetti bowl of Reno compared to others throughout the city of Reno. Using the guidance in the report to document the subdivision as a district on a single inventory form also saved time and effort over producing hundreds of individual forms. And in the case of Silverado, this would have been 244 individual inventory forms. Overall, for the project, it was estimated that the team was able to complete field survey in less than 20% of the time typically required, taking not much more than a day or so versus what may have taken up to a week to do the individual survey of the 200 plus properties. The Nevada DOT also estimated that their review of project deliverables took less than 50% of the time it would have taken to review traditional survey documentation. And after its review, the SHPO described the project as, quote, an excellent example of the balance necessary to ensure that critical infrastructure occurs while taking historic properties into consideration. So next, has been mentioned by several people already in this session, I'm excited to give you a preview of the new ongoing NCHRP study focusing on post-war commercial properties. For this study, commercial property types included, but are not limited to, shopping centers, drugstores, restaurants, motels, office buildings, and office parks. And as David mentioned, this study is focusing on these properties constructed from 1945 to 1980. Similar to the residential study, this study is being undertaken to assist DOTs, SHPOs, TIPOs, and preservation professionals with challenges of consideration of post-war commercial properties. The 2 main goals of the study was first to provide DOTs with a structured, replicable methodology to determine eligibility of post-war commercial properties, and second, to provide practitioners ready guidance that will streamline project delivery and provide regulatory partners with consistent and thorough eligibility evaluations. This study began last year and it's ongoing, and it's being completed in 4 steps. The first is the development of an annotated bibliography of literature and resources related to post-war commercial property types. The second is the identification of sources and data needed in order to develop an appropriate historic context to complete a significant evaluation. The third is the development of a property type specific methodology for evaluating National Register eligibility. This methodology during the project will be tested by applying it to up to 3 different property types in several geographic locations. And this will allow the project team and the research panel to improve and revise the methodology based on its practical application. Finally, the preparation of a guidance document will bring these pieces together for use by cultural resource professionals. I'm assuming your next question is, when will the study be completed and the guidance document available? Well, you're gonna need to hold tight for just a little bit. We're making progress, but we still have plenty of work to do, and the guidance document will be available in the spring of 2023. That is our presentation. I guess we're happy to take any questions, and I'll take a look at the chat to catch up. Oh, I see a question about if the Silverado neighborhood was determined eligible or not. It was determined not eligible. Overall, it had a lack of integrity to hold together cohesively. Happy to address any other questions that you have on either the residential study or the post-war commercial study that's ongoing.
I see kind of a long one in the chat, so I can read
Oh.
that. Or in the Q&A. Chris Bell says that he's concerned that the focus is on the national standard. And what about the vernacular evolution based on location, context, etc.? Can we continue working through the full Section 106 process with just those resources? I wonder where we draw the line.
The NCHR report 723 does recognize that there are regional variations, and that is written into the survey methodology so that professionals in the field may recognize that they're seeing something very different, that there's a variation in materials or styles, and that should be considered when they're completing the survey and evaluation process.
And there's another in the Q&A that asks, did you consider the subdivision's development as a whole, including transportation networks, commercial, recreational, not just individual integrity of housing?
Yes, the guidance document for the evaluation methodology does have quite a bit of detail regarding criterion A and some of the factors that should be considered when evaluating significance. And I may have misread that. I think Summer, you may also be asking if the recreational components like parks, green spaces, if there were commercial set-asides, and then vehicular roads that were going through the subdivisions were considered, and that was also the case. The methodology does have a discussion of that as well.
I see a question in the chat about defining the post-World War II timeframe. And for the post-war commercial study, it was decided to extend it to 1980 for the purposes of that study.
Okay, here's one more in the Q&A. Will there be guidance using qualified professionals in the field to make those important decisions?
I believe both documents refer to using qualified professionals, but most state requirements do have minimal qualifications for professionals who are completing the surveys and evaluations.
All right, anyone else have any questions? Oh, got two more. Holly asks again, but does it specify to using SOI qualified architectural historians specifically?
I don't recall if the report 723 does, but I think each state's practitioner requirements would supersede whatever we would recommend in the report.
And then one more, is the idea of built-in obsolescence tackled when evaluating post-World War II properties?
Can you repeat that? Was it building obsolescence?
Is the idea of built-in obsolescence tackled when evaluating post-World War II properties?
I think that's a good question, and I don't think we addressed that in the residential study. And so it's something we can consider for the post-war commercial study.
All right. I think that's probably it for questions. If anybody has any more, you can feel free to just keep putting them in the Q&A or the chat, and then we can email those over to people after the presentations. Okay.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.
Perfect. So I think we're going to go to the break early. Tony, I don't know if you had anything that you wanted to say before that.
Yeah, let's go ahead and do the break early. So this, we're running about a half hour early, which is oftentimes good. So let's go ahead and break, do the half hour break into 2:30. And this may even allow us a little bit more opportunity in the lightning round. So when we come back at 2:30, Scott, it'll be all yours.
Perfect.
Sounds good, Tony. Thanks. Okay, now that we're recording, I will go ahead and get the second part of this meeting started. Welcome back, everyone. Thank you for tuning back in to our lightning round. We've got 9 different states that are going to give you kind of a quick overview of ways they've either been dealing with these post-World War II resources or are planning to deal with them. The speakers will go one after the other. I'm going to start with Nikki Sen from Arkansas DOT, and then Nikki, when you're done, you just kick it off to the next person, and we'll hold questions till the end. So thank you much, and Nikki, take it away.
Okay, had to find my unmute button. Sorry about that.
Okay, I better find my mute button.
Whoops, and then I need to get this off full screen so that I have my notes. Oops. Sorry, technical difficulties. Good thing we have a minute.
We do, and we can see the presentation on our end.
Excellent. Okay, from there, I will go ahead and start. Hello, I'm Nikki Sen with the Arkansas Department of Transportation. So I'm going to kick off this round with some discussion about the lack of research resources that we've encountered here for post-war structure analysis and our solution to it. My examples include ranch-style houses, but the discussion really applies to all post-war structures. I'll start it with a little background. While we are aware of the NCHRP report for identifying and evaluating post-World War II housing, our SHPO has some trust issues, which in the past, very understandable. So our surveys include individual houses, even if they are a similar type, instead of grouping them together like the report says you can. In Arkansas, we have a lot of rural ranch style houses. They replace many older farmhouses popped up along main roadways without a planned development, as well as those that developed in the subdivisions near urban areas. Next slide. Our SHPO staff has a survey database that they allow us to view for research. It's only available to CR professionals, and we have requested queries from this database to establish how many post-war houses, commercial buildings, et cetera, they have already surveyed. And at this point, the database is locked down by the state IT department with control outside of the SHPO's office. So they don't have the capability to create this type of query. And you can see from this slide, their eligible structures are not differentiated by color. All structures surveyed, no matter their eligibility status, appear in orange. In requesting the post-war buildings, I also requested known or suspected significant early subdivisions or developments to help our mid-century research. The SHPO staff knew of 3 off the top of their head. All of them are based in Little Rock, Broadmoor, University Heights, and the Palisades. And Broadmoor will be the only one that shows up in this database because it's the only one that's been nominated to the National Register at this point. Next slide. Back to the trust issue. We've had disagreements with our SHPO on eligibility of ranch-style houses in particular. So one disagreement included 3 houses on our 30 Crossing project involving Interstate 30 and 40 in both Little Rock and North Little Rock. The area in question was developed in North Little Rock in the late 1920s, and several houses were also built in the 1930s and 40s. However, that's when development really slowed. Many lots remained undeveloped into the mid-century. So the first house, property 18, shown here, was determined eligible. It had all of the expected ideal ranch style traits, including the integrated porch, carport, and landscaping with the brick wall enclosing the backyard. It was completely original. The homeowner confirmed its 1961 build date and its history. So there was no SHPO argument here. Next slide. But then you go a little further east and 2 other ranch style houses were built a little bit later. And remember, this subdivision was not a post-war specific development. It was developed in the 1920s with later infill. So these common ranch style houses, although original, did not illustrate the best example of the type. The SHPO disagreed because of their integrity, that they provided no data or argument to support their claim. So we submitted further documentation showing that of the 189 properties surveyed, 46% consisted of some variation of the ranch style house. Within 2 blocks of these houses, 16 other ranch style houses existed. So as a common style, these 2 houses held no significance. The SHPO staff acknowledged the lack of significance, although hesitantly. Next slide. So the ranch style debate prompted us to streamline our research and better organize our architectural resource surveys, or our ARSs. David mentioned using GIS capabilities earlier today, and that's just what we've done. Our environmental GIS staff developed a database to help us realize our goals. And from this, we should be able to run our own queries, at least for the buildings that we have surveyed. We call this new tool our ARS viewer, but it's really so much more. We'll be able to see more data pulled into one place, and we can track structures by type, style, date, etc. We're still in the process of backfilling data not previously captured over the last 6+ years, but we will be querying soon. Next slide. So you can see on this slide our ARS data, and along with it, we have the SHPO data color coded for eligibility instead of that all orange. And we show the boundaries of area historic districts as well. Next slide. This valuable tool is still getting layers added to it, but as you can see down the left side of the screen, although on here it might be a bit blurry for you, we have a good start. So this viewer will show our job status, project locations, color-coded SHPO data, assessor parcel data, township, section, range, cemeteries, GLO maps, quad maps, Sanborn maps, Trail of Tears, Civil War battlefields, etc., all in one GIS place to assist us with research. And instead of relying on SHPO, who has the limited staff and means, we can provide the data up front to support our eligibility determinations on post-World War II ranch-style houses, along with all other post-war resources that we record. Next slide. And now that I've shared our most recent streamlining tool, I'll turn it back over to the next presenter. So moving on to California.
Okay. Thank you. I'm Jill Hubb. I'm a senior environmental planner in the California DOT headquarters Cultural Studies Office, and I'm also an architectural historian. In California, about 6 million housing units were constructed in the first 30 years following World War II, and more than half of those were single-family residences. When these properties started turning 50 years old, and we had to evaluate them for historical significance under Section 106 and state laws that apply to cultural resources, it was a huge challenge for us for a number of reasons. The post-war housing boom was clearly an important theme in California history under Criterion A of the National Register criteria. This slide is showing the post-war house demonstration home in Los Angeles, Wilshire Boulevard, that was featured in national publications like Life magazine and House Beautiful in 1946. We could go to the next slide. Okay. The California Ranch became something of a post-war ideal that could be constructed anywhere through purchase of standardized plans or prefab housing like the Cliff May ranchos that could be shipped anywhere in the country and assembled by a local builder. The next slide, please. Oh, thank you. This is a post-war California ranch house constructed in LA in the Valley. It was built by Kaiser Homes. That was Kaiser was a shipbuilder who immediately after the war turned to industrialized home building in Los Angeles area. That was featured in Better Homes and Gardens, October 1949. Next slide, please. This is Panorama City, built by Kaiser Homes in Los Angeles County. For our work, the problem was the sheer scope of the survey effort. As you know, when Section 106 says you look at the property as a whole, and so the property we're talking about wasn't just the dozen or so homes along our freeway right away. It was the whole tract that could include hundreds of houses and also related structures like schools and shopping centers. Next slide, please. And another issue that folks were struggling with was that a lot of these homes are fairly modest in architectural style under Criterion C, yet they were in a large part designed by an architect like Hacienda Gardens out by Pomona. That was designed by Harold Zook, and they didn't have a lot of architectural style, but they are intact. They're not necessarily altered, and they are very good examples of their period in history. So folks were struggling with how to evaluate these, how to apply the criteria, and not come up with 6 million eligible tract houses. We can go to the next slide, please. National Parks had come out with the bulletin on evaluating residential suburbs, but it wasn't that useful for us in California. We found it was more East Coast centric. So in 2011, California, at Caltrans, we developed our own tract house context study that covers the years 1945 to 1973. We chose 1973 as the cutoff. For us, that was really marked an end of the era. The post-war boom was over. The housing market really fell off because of the oil embargo and things like that. So that's where we came up with that date. It provides the context needed to evaluate these housing tracts, and it identifies important themes like the Cold War, the housing boom, and developments in tract house construction and segregation in housing, things like that. It suggests methods to streamline the evaluation process and identifies the kinds of character defining features that should be intact and what's a significant alteration or what's not so important, and try to make it easier to survey these large properties and assess integrity, which was a hard thing that people were having trouble with. That can stay. California has a programmatic agreement with Federal Highway, ACHP, and the SHPO for how we apply compliance with Section 106. And in 2014, a provision was added to it that allows qualified architectural historians to exempt housing tracts from evaluation. It means Caltrans gets to decide if the properties have potential for historical significance, and if they don't, then no further review is required. We need to use the context study to make that decision. There's a number of caveats that apply, and robust background research effort is expected. A lot of properties, especially those with the modern style, more high style of architecture, have been listed on the National Register or included in local surveys since the study was published. So we want to, we're not going to accidentally exempt something that's important. But overall, very few post-war tracts are getting formally evaluated these days. And that's been working for us so far. We haven't had any issues with that. The context study is on our website if anyone would like to look at it. And I think that's all from California. We're gonna go on to Colorado.
Hi, I'm Barbara Stocklin-Steely. I'm the senior historian for CDOT Region 1, which is the Denver metro area. I'm going to talk about the survey form that we use at CDOT, primarily in Denver, to record post-World War II residential subdivisions. Next slide. Yeah, so like many other regions of the country, Denver saw a tremendous population boom and growth of residential suburbs around Denver after World War II. And of course, we started seeing more projects that were affecting these properties as they became 50 years old. Typically, as I'm sure many of you have experienced, as you can see on this slide on the right-hand side, the area of potential effects for this project, which is I-70 west of Denver. The AP is shown, the area potential effects is shown in orange, and the post-World War II subdivision, Applewood Ranchettes, is green shaded. So we define the AP as basically the first row of houses. It was just a noise wall replacement project. The houses were relatively intact, as you see on the left, but we did not want to just record those individual houses. We thought we should record the entire subdivision. So that started a discussion with our SHPO, this was about 2017, as to how we would do this recordation. Next slide. One thing that we do have in the Denver metro area is we have a historic context that was developed in 2010. It's from 1940 to 1965, but it's a very robust historic context that really has a lot of information on the post-World War II builders and developers. It provides geographic data kind of by community, talks about different property types, and has a lot of data analysis by subdivision, by type of subdivision, and by area. It also has a lot of discussion about the different subdivision types, a domestic subdivision, which is basically just houses, a multiple filing subdivision that might have other amenities like a school or church, planned suburban communities like North Glen in Colorado. It also had registration requirements as well as a discussion on integrity. So we had this really good resource as a starting point for evaluating post-World War II subdivisions in the Denver metro area. And this was a couple years before the NCHRP report. Next slide. We also in Colorado, the same year that Denver, that the historic context was completed, the Colorado SHPO issued a new survey form. We use template survey forms that the State Historic Preservation Office issues. And this one was called the architectural inventory form that we use for most built environment resources is called Form 1403. They developed a form called 1403B, which is the post-World War II residential suburban subdivision form, which is a mouthful. And basically, this was the form that was developed to document larger or post-World War II subdivisions where you could record things maybe by model and maybe not have photographs and detailed information on every single building. So in 2017, we thought this is great, we'll use this survey form. But when we reached out to the SHPO said that they didn't really like the form and didn't really want us to use the form because they had issued the form, but what users were doing apparently is they were using the multiple property documentation from 2010 and not doing any individualized or regional research above that, and that they were doing a very cursory look at the individual properties within the subdivision. They also were worried that we were kind of missing criteria A and B on the survey form. So we worked with the SHPO over the course of about 6 months to modify the survey form so that they would feel more comfortable for us to use it. So basically, the version that I'm going to show you is the version that was modified through that discussion in 2017. So basically, we committed that for every subdivision we would use, for every subdivision recordation, we would do an additional historic context that was specific to that subdivision and that area where that subdivision was located, and that would be relatively robust. We also agreed to provide information by model, and you can see this example on the screen. I think this was one we did in 2018 called Clear Creek Vista. It was in Wheat Ridge, Colorado, as part of an environmental system. So this subdivision, which you see on the far right, which is relatively small, it's kind of that rectangular loop, maybe had about 30 homes and 2 models. So we just had to show a photograph of the models and the locations of the different houses that met that model. And we also looked at analyzed the layout and the streetscape. Next slide. The other thing that we agreed to do is that for all of the properties in the APE, we would, if they were not in the first tables, there's basically 3 tables we agreed to do. The first table is kind of the model, table by model number or model type. The second table we agreed to do is that we would have a row or a table that would capture all of the properties in the APE. So like in the first slide that I showed where there were just a row of houses in the APE, we would make sure that at least they were all featured individually on a second table. And then on the right, we also agreed that we would do a good amount of archival research. And if any of the properties within that subdivision kind of surfaced as having an important association with an event or a person or didn't quite fit the other houses, that we would do a separate survey form on them. So in this case, there actually was a farmhouse in the middle of the subdivision. The post-World War II subdivision was built on that farmland. So we did a separate survey form on the house that you see on the right, which is logical. Next slide. This is just kind of a summary slide. You can skip this one. Just go to the next one. Okay. So since 2017, we've used this survey form about 15 times. There are 4 subdivisions that were found to be eligible, and the SHPO has concurred on all of our determinations of eligibility for these post-World War II subdivisions since we modified the form. This one is an eligible one. It is called North Star Hills. It was part of the North I-25 EA. It's located in an area maybe about 30 minutes north of Denver. This was a multiple filing subdivision, so it had also had a park and a school. It had a planetary theme, which I thought was really cool. It had model names like the Stardust, the North Star, and the Rainbow, and street names like Planet Place and Milky Way. It had a more complex curvilinear street system, cul-de-sacs, unusual trapezoidal shaped lots, tree plantings by the developer. It was plotted and developed within a 1-year period. It had a number of different house types. It had ranch bi-level and tri-level and had different variations of them. So for that region and that area, it definitely kind of was unique. And we found that subdivision to be eligible. Next slide. We did a relatively robust historic context, which you can see on the left-hand side. That's just one page from it, where we really discussed the post-World War II subdivision in this area along North I-25 and placed all the different, as part of the study, we actually looked at 4 post-World War II subdivisions. So this was the context not only for North Star Hills, but for 3 others. And then on the right, you see the bottom right is the rainbow, the rainbow model. But we basically flushed out the different models. We did not document every single house. We just flushed out typical examples of the different styles. So that's just kind of a snapshot into one way that one DOT is trying to streamline our documentation and evaluation in partnership with the SHPO, and it's been relatively effective. I am Anna, and I'm going to turn it over to Florida.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. I'm Lindsay Rothrock. I am in FDOT's OEM office, which is not one of our districts. It is the Office of Environmental Management. I'm a cultural resource specialist, but I'm an archaeologist. We are taking a kind of phased approach, and we're pretty early on in our plan right now for how to deal with these different types of resources. So we have partnered with an architectural historian consultant firm and kind of came up with 2 different phases. For phase 1, we wanted to get a lay of the land. So we had them go out and do a summary of the 2 reports generated by NCHRP, do some research and report back on the current status of guidance and survey methodologies in other states through the US, kind of focusing on similar states that have geographic or demographic similarities to Florida. We had a bibliography of primary and secondary sources combined, and then also had them provide some suggestions for what our next steps should be to move forward and how to maybe solve or address the issue that we have in Florida. So in 2019, we retained their services, and in 2020, we had our first milestone of the phase 1 results. And after a lot of research, they were able to hone in on California, Georgia, Maryland, and South Carolina as the states that had at least the greatest similarities to Florida. And when it became clear that we couldn't just adopt another state's approach in its entirety, they also went ahead and kind of highlighted some of the different approaches or guidance that's provided by these similar states that may work for Florida that we may be able to incorporate into what we end up choosing to do. They kind of concluded and recommended that we establish a statewide context, but also to highlight 4 different regions in like smaller thematic contexts. And their suggestion was to do kind of the Panhandle in North Florida, Central Florida, and then breaking up the South into a Southwest and Southeast portion. During the phase 1, they also did some case studies with 3 cities in Florida where they looked at 3 metropolitan areas, gathered statistics on population, pre and post-war, looked at property appraiser and parcel data for actual year build dates, other factors to evaluate the various development trends that were going on. And those case studies that they presented to us for Miami, Orlando, and Jacksonville. And of course, we ended up with a very robust suggested bibliography for the next stage of the development of our contexts. They also concluded that phase 1 portion of the project by recommending some key things that would be special for us to pay extra attention to. In addition to the statewide context, to develop an evaluation methodology, focusing not only on the individual eligibility of structures, but also on how we can evaluate neighborhoods and historic districts when there is no cohesive subdivision or when there is no planned overarching development for the area. And ultimately, utilizing the context and that evaluation method, they recommended that we'll also need to create a more effective survey methodology that'll allow FDOT to better meet its responsibilities and obligations for these resources in the face of just the sheer growing volume of resources becoming relevant, becoming historic in age. So we now have phase 2 underway, which is actually the development of these contexts. And through discussion, we pulled the SHPO's office in to kind of review and lend their support to our undertaking. And we also had people from the Florida Master Site File join in on the conversation. They are the repository for all historic recorded resources in the state. And ultimately, we kind of decided that a statewide context was absolutely necessary. We actually ended up with 5 regional themes after a discussion of the Panhandle and kind of Northeast Florida being 2 separate regions. So currently, those 6 different contexts are under development. And we've also closely coordinated with compliance and review staff members within the SHPO's office, as well as the National Register section staff that works at our Division of Historical Resources in our sister agency, the Department of State, really to pool all of the expertise that is available and also to get a lot of input for the people who will be reviewing all of these reports and these recommendations that will be coming out of this context, and also hopefully a context that will be applicable a little bit beyond even just FDOT projects, but for anyone who's out recording these types of resources where we just don't have a great clear guidance yet. We came up with a couple of other specific topics that we're going to be paying attention to as we move forward. We are, of course, going to be continuing our collaboration with SHPO and the DHR staff, especially on once we arrive at having this context and even the evaluation methodology, how are we going to implement it? Will there be any alterations to our current survey strategy, which is to not group housing into one unit and just have a representative example? We do have the current status is that every structure gets individually recorded and then evaluated. So, a discussion point is going forward is there going to be any changes to that survey methodology? And then there were some other important points that were raised, such as awareness for that condition shouldn't get confused with integrity for these types of resources. as well as the consideration of residential additions or enclosures as contributing characteristics to significance when we do establish that evaluation criteria. And then we also have a standardized form system that the Florida Master Site File has control over and provides for everything that's recorded in the state. And we've discussed how maybe some additions to that form for the standing structure recording form will help better capture these resources once we do figure out those specific styles that we will be providing in that guidance. So we're still very early on. I'm very excited to see our next milestone when we get these contexts fleshed out and start really discussing how we're going to evaluate all of these resources and how we can possibly alter or slightly tweak our survey methods to capture the resources and give them due consideration, but also take into consideration just the sheer volume that we'll be dealing with very shortly. But with that, I turn it over to our next presenter.
All right. Hi, my name is Anthony Ross, and I'm a historian and senior environmental manager at the Indiana Department of Transportation. Apologies, right now I can't get my camera to work, but that's all right. I have the slides up. So today I'll be talking about our office's strategies and challenges in evaluating post-war cultural resources, particularly potential residential historic districts. So you can go to the next slide. So for the past 3 years or so, we've been working with a multiple property documentation form called Residential Planning and Development in Indiana, which covers the years 1940 to 1973. And the MPDF echoes many of the same historical themes and evaluation techniques as the NCHRP report. But of course, it's state specific and has superseded the NCHRP report for us. So the first thing to know about the MPDF is it's big. It contains a ton of useful historic context, a lot of information, and rightly so, since it covers a huge number of cultural resources. About 900,000 residential units were constructed in Indiana during the time period. Not as many as California's 6 million, but pretty big. So to the right of your screen, you can see a map showing the location of these units. You can see right in the middle is Indianapolis, and the city of Indianapolis alone has more than 50,000 of them. So our early experiences with using the MPDF to evaluate potential historic districts stress the importance of comparative research. And one comparative method, of course, is with regard to architecture and design. Does a subdivision possess distinctive design characteristics when compared to others? So we did that, but then it gets a little harder. And as in other cases where we have a bunch of resources that kind of look alike at first glance, we turn to the historical record to help us differentiate neighborhoods in terms of their historic significance, especially with regard to significance under criterion A. So for instance, was the subdivision associated with a particular group, such as a specific group of factory workers, or a group that faced discrimination and segregation, such as African Americans or Jewish Americans? This is especially important, of course, within the context of a housing market characterized by racial and class segregation. Was the subdivision the first of its kind in its area, or did it influence other developments? So we believe that this comparative research-driven strategy was in line with our interpretation of the MPDF. The MPDF stressed kind of comparative framework in terms of evaluating districts. And, that was also in line with the NCHRP report too. Okay, so far so good. And I wish I could stop there and this session could just be dedicated to the rewards of having such a deeply researched MPDF. But things started to unravel a little bit in 2019. So you can go to the next slide now. So we started to disagree with our SHPO. Specifically, we started to see our SHPO saying neighborhoods were eligible without much, or really, in our opinion, any evidence of comparative significance within their local contexts. One early example is Lawrence Court, seen here. To us, it looked like a common example of a small 1950s subdivision comprised of ranch houses. There were many other comparable examples in the Evansville area. And the consultants who prepared the historic property report were unable to find really any documentation from the historical record regarding the neighborhood, even the name of the developer, let alone kind of establish a narrative of significance or influence within the community. And yet we got a response from SHPO saying it was eligible under both criterion A and criterion C. So next slide. So another key tipping point was when we received the results of a windshield survey that SHPO conducted in association with the MPDF. It identified about a dozen, I think, historic districts across the state. Some of them we agreed with, others not so much. Here are a couple of examples. The one on the left is outside of Louisville, and the one on the right is outside of Indianapolis. And a number of these determinations were made, at least as far as we could tell, without much comparative analysis and with very little primary document research. Instead, the takeaway for us was that SHPO's eligibility opinions were really based on how these neighborhoods fit into the topology of post-war neighborhoods that the MPDF described. And so you can go to the next slide. So according to our MPDF, there are 5 types of post-war historic districts: World War II era, transitional, tract, custom, and plant. I won't go into all of them here. Be happy to do that some other time. But the upshot for us was that SHPO was making determinations based on whether a neighborhood possessed the characteristics of one of these types. And really whether it was if it was a good example of one of these types, even if it wasn't necessarily compared, it didn't necessarily stand out in comparison to other types in its local context, it was still eligible. So we haven't given up on comparative research. We still want to follow the guidelines that we see in our MPDF and are found elsewhere, such as in the NCHRP report. But more recently, we have devoted more effort to analyzing potential districts under this topology. So you can go to the next slide. Even then, though, when we focus just on the topology, we're finding it difficult to come to an agreement with our SHPO on a number of neighborhoods. We've had neighborhoods that, in our opinion, pretty clearly don't fit the characteristics of any of the types. And yet, in response, we've found that SHPO has shown a pretty flexible approach to applying the topology. Hybrids of types, new versions of types, things that don't appear in the MPDF have all come into play in our consultation with SHPO about these neighborhoods. And at the moment, we feel like we don't have much to go on in terms of differentiating eligible neighborhoods from not eligible neighborhoods. Or I should say, we don't know how our SHPO will differentiate them. I hate to say it, but we're kind of at a loss unless we just say everything is eligible. And this is coming from someone, me, who spent years of grad school studying post-war cities and suburbs. And in fact, a significant majority of post-war neighborhoods that have been evaluated as part of our 106 processes have been identified as eligible by SHPO. So more recently, our SHPO has even made eligibility calls based on the MPDF, which supposedly ends in 1973, for neighborhoods that predominantly were constructed after 1973. So we're kind of at a crossroads. We've got several projects that are undergoing 106 consultation and include eligibility disagreements with SHPO. All of these photos are from a different one of those neighborhoods. And who knows, we could make a breakthrough in our consultation efforts and find common ground. We're still working towards that goal. But if the logic of our recent SHPO opinions is extended across Indiana, we're looking at a huge new wave of historic properties. It's really unprecedented. People talk about the bungalows. This goes way beyond that, in our opinion. And that will have serious ramifications for transportation planning and the field of historic preservation in our state. Going forward, we could face a future where these types of resources increasingly dominate our consultation processes with unpredictable and unexpected consequences. Project schedules and design are being significantly impacted right now. And I gotta say, a lot of our staff time is being dedicated to evaluating these resources that to us seem to be run-of-the-mill post-war subdivisions. And there's plenty of other types of resources that could be evaluated, in our opinion, that aren't receiving so much attention because of the amount of time dedicated to these types of resources. So I could go on. I'll be happy to talk if anyone would like to contact me. My email is up there, and I'm looking forward to hear what the rest of the states say. So I'll hand it over to Maryland.
Hi, like Anthony, my video is not showing. I'm not sure what that's about, but I'm Ann Bruder, Senior Architectural Historian with the Maryland Department of Transportation, State Highway Administration in Baltimore. So good afternoon, or it is afternoon for all of us. So good afternoon. Next slide, please. All right. I was a member of the 2010-2012 NCHRP study panel for NCHRP 723 that investigated the model for post-World War II houses and house identification and evaluations. As I will explain, the Maryland DOT has not incorporated those practices into our survey guidelines, and neither has the Maryland Historical Trust, which is the State Historic Preservation Office. They haven't required them. In 1998, State Highway began its suburbanization study for suburbs from 1870 to 1960 in Prince George's and Montgomery counties, which are the counties that surround Washington, D.C. And if you look down at the bottom, I don't think I have a pointer, unfortunately, but the north boundary of the District of Columbia is at the bottom towards the right, but everything that you're looking at there was either built before 1945 in blue or after 1945 in red, and that's just to 1960. When you have almost 400 years of building history, and may I have the next slide, please? When you have almost 400 years of history with George Washington spending the night in the house on the upper right, that's the Magruder House in Montgomery County. And for my Virginia friends, that brick house is from 1685. It's called Troth's Fortune, and it is on Maryland's Eastern Shore. And this last house on the bottom is actually a mid-19th century house that was built or bought by Clark Clifford, who was a well-known Washington lawyer. But when you have that kind of history, you can be very picky about what you would consider for eligibility. May I have the next slide, please? Railroad suburbs such as Hyattstown, shown on the left, and Craftsman bungalows found favor. And the next slide. Not every modest brick-clad dwelling is rejected. The house on the left is the Rachel Carson house. You might recognize her name. She wrote Silent Spring while she lived in this house, and she actually designed the house. But most of the houses, such as those shown on the right, either individually or collectively, do not meet the high bar that MHT has set. May I have the next slide, please? All right. My family lived for almost 50 years in a development called Waynewood near Mount Vernon on what was part of Washington's River Farm on the Virginia side of the Potomac River. The development has 2 pools, a tennis and basketball courts, and a baseball diamond, along with an elementary school. Churches, schools, and a shopping center make it a convenient place to live. And it is now almost 70 years old. That, along with a course that I took at UVA with Richard Guy Wilson on 20th century architecture, helped to inform my view in 1998 as I began to assist SHA in the suburbanization context. As SHPO's staff, I recommended that we adapt the model we had used for Baltimore's many row house neighborhoods. One form for each neighborhood, identify the 5 to 7 different models, consider the amenities, including sidewalks and cul-de-sacs, and the pools and baseball diamonds. And that set the standard for how we evaluate suburban housing development in Maryland, one inventory form for each neighborhood. That's not to say that we don't have eligible and listed post-war housing. It includes a house by Frank Lloyd Wright that was built for his son, Robert Llewellyn Wright, several Charles Goodman developments in Montgomery County, and again, for my Virginia friends, Mr. Goodman was quite busy in Montgomery County. This house is from Hammond Woods, which was built between 1949 and 1951. And also, I'm showing you the Marlborough House, which was done by a local firm called Cohen and Haft between 1962 and 1965. And may I have the next slide, please? We've developed a second context for the same area that takes us through 1980 for building types, although we're not evaluating anything that isn't 50 years old yet. And this is a shed-style house on Grubby Thicket Lane at Academy Woods, and it was built in 1971. Although we're having difficulties finding the name of an architect. And one of our problems is that Montgomery County had such a rapid residential development in the 50s, 60s, and 70s that they chose not to keep their building permits, and so we have no access to them. May I have the next slide, please? But stepping away from the DC and also the Baltimore suburbs, I have a question for the group about what you're doing in smaller towns or distant cities that just aren't the center of industrial or commercial development. I'm thinking about county seats in what was mostly a rural county that had a sufficient commercial base, military installations, and manufacturing to attract new residents who wanted and needed new housing since there wasn't enough old housing. How do your contexts address that phenomenon? Here are 2 examples in Maryland. The first is National Homes, which come from Indiana, and these were prefabricated houses, and they were designed by Charles Goodman, who estimated that he had built, as a result of the National Homes models, 10,000 houses, although I don't think that's quite correct, but that was his estimate. And the second one is, and the Goodman House is near Bel Air, which is northeast of Baltimore. And the second one is what we would call a rambler. The word ranch house doesn't usually surface in traditional Maryland, but this was in a neighborhood called Coverwood in LaVale, which is in Western Maryland. And we've never had to take the Goodman houses to the SHPO for an evaluation, although I would say that many of the houses are not quite as, they're not really Goodman designs. They're very traditional, sort of Cape Cod kind of things. And I'm not sure that we would get an agreement for eligibility on Wakefield Forest, and the SHPO disagreed that with our determination that Coverwood is eligible. Although one of the things that I learned through my research was that the Builders Association, the man who designed it, was active in the National Builders Association, and you know, that kind of activity, I think, is something we don't understand. But I think that's the end of my slides, so I will turn it over to Texas, I believe. Oh, Missouri, I beg your pardon. Okay.
Texas is great, but a lot of Texans came from Missouri. So when I came to MoDOT in 2000, or let me start here. Hi, I'm Karen Daniels. I'm with the Missouri Department of Transportation, and I am an architectural historian, although my title is Senior Historic Preservation Specialist. When I came to MoDOT in 2001, I almost immediately started working on what would become an environmental impact statement, a project called the new I-64, a project in the St. Louis metropolitan area that included the city of St. Louis and about 2 tiers of first-generation suburbs. MoDOT's standard method at this time for these kinds of projects was to look at properties more than 50 years old in what was called the first phase of the survey, and not look at resources less than 50 years old until the second phase of the survey, when a preferred alternative had been chosen and the archaeological surveys were also being done. This methodology did not include the possibility really of checking for exceptional significance of resources that were less than 50 years old, and it left us open to delays in projects for resources that did have exceptional significance and were not yet 50 years old. And this became a real issue on the new I-64. If I could have the next slide, please. So in 2003, when we were getting ready to start work on the second tier of the Improve I-70 project and the NEPA studies for that, we talked with SHPO and wanted to apply a new methodology to our surveys to take some lessons learned from the new I-64 project and some other surveys that had been done, and base that methodology on those lessons learned to improve the quality of the surveys that we were doing, improve the efficiency of our survey work, and get a better product. So we came up with a 3 categories for level of effort for the resources we dealt with. And part of the old methodology was SHPO got an inventory form for every resource that we surveyed that was more than 50 years old. They did not even bother to keep those inventory forms unless the resource was historic. So we were generating a lot of paperwork that basically ended up in the trash can. So knowing that, we talked with SHPO about, for those resources that are, at the time it was pre-1945, we will only provide those inventory forms for resources that we are recommending as eligible for the National Register. We will provide you with photographs and descriptions of resources that were constructed before 1945, but we're not going to go to the effort of filling out an inventory form for you to throw it out. They agreed to that. That was one of our first major victories on our discussion. We really kind of talked over the dates. Our Improve I-70 project was a statewide project. It went from metropolitan Kansas City to metropolitan St. Louis. So it was eventually divided into 7 segments of independent utility. It crosses very rural Missouri, lots of farmland, but we go through suburban Kansas City, suburban St. Louis, and right in the middle is the Columbia area where the University of Missouri is located. So we've got lots of small towns, lots of farmland, lots of suburbs. So we knew that we were going to be generating a lot of paperwork anyway. So we said, okay, pre-1945 resources will, I described it at the time of, we'll treat it like we're generating a National Register nomination form. We'll do an inventory, we'll do the descriptions, we'll take photographs, we'll make sure everything's identified on the map, and we'll do site plans for resources where there is, where there are 3 or more resources on any given property. For resources that were constructed between 1975 or 1945 and 1970, we would take photographs of the resource and we would identify them on mapping. And we chose 1970 because we were looking at the suburban development in those Kansas City and St. Louis metro areas. St. Charles was one of our fastest growing counties for basically starting in the 1950s, and it continues to this day, really. We knew that there were significant suburban development that continued into the 1960s, the late 1960s, that was going to be in our area of potential effects. So we wanted to make sure that we accurately and adequately considered those suburbs. So we said we would provide photographs and mapping for resources constructed through 1970. And we were very fortunate because we had aerial mapping or aerial photographs for the entire I-70 corridor that were taken both before the interstate was constructed and after the interstate was constructed. So we could immediately identify resources that had been constructed before the before we put the interstate in, and those that were still there afterward. And those photographs were dated 1970. After resources constructed after 1970, we would just identify them on a map. We would look at them while we were out in the field if we saw something, but at that time that was 30 years old. We would identify them on mapping, but we'd always consider that there could be that exceptionally significant 30-year-old resource out there. We'd keep our eyes open. We didn't find anything. Could I have the next slide, please? Subdivisions. We treated subdivisions regardless of their age like one property. This was another lesson learned, not just from the new I-64, but from many other projects, including one where we relocated a railroad overpass and basically obliterated a 1930s subdivision. So we wanted to consider the histories of these subdivisions as one property because they all share that one history. We always made sure when we were looking at the subdivisions to look for properties that were developed before the subdivision was platted, or for those subdivisions that incurred a long period of development. Most of the ones that ended up being in our APE had a very short period of development simply because of where they were. They were mostly in the St. Charles area. So we pulled the plat maps for them. For those that were multiple periods, we welded them together. We did streetscapes of the areas throughout the subdivision, photographs of any resource that would actually be removed by our improvements, representative types we identified, and significant landscape features we identified. And we did a general history of the subdivision, which fit within the context that we developed for each SIU individually. We did not do any history of individual buildings. Okay, next slide, please. I'm trying to go myself and it's not going to work. So just to give you an idea of what that looked like in report form, we put all of that data into a table and onto the mapping. This is the interchange at Warrenton, which is a fairly small town. And the table associated with this actually shows these properties. So we identified each property with, it was constructed before 1945, constructed between 45 and 70, after 70, or there were no resources within the APE. So, and we had 1,200 parcels in the SIU 7, which is where Warrenton is. And it's the one I am most familiar with because it's the one that I feel like I walked every inch of. All right, can I have the next slide, please? Okay, I said we did this in 2003. Time marches on, and the area of resources that time marched on most for was that middle category between 1945 and less than 30 years old. We eventually, in consultation with the SHPO, just said, that category really doesn't seem to matter much anymore. So what we're going to do is really look at resources that were constructed more than 45 years ago for projects in our STIP, and more than 40 years ago for projects where we're doing an EA or an EIS. That gives those resources a little bit more shelf life for the life of the project. For resources that are more than 45 years old, we still provide photographs, descriptions, tables, mapping, site plans, inventory forms if we're recommending them as eligible. For resources less than 45 years old, we do them on mapping and tables. We're always looking for resources that are exceptionally significant. Our tables have changed quite a bit because now we actually do a little bit of a description in the table. Any resource that is constructed before 1945 actually gets a written description in our report. But it allows us to spend time working on the resources that actually matter, like the one on the left, rather than on the ones that don't matter, like the one on the right. Because I would much rather spend my time working on anything other than a Butler building or a mobile home. But anyway, can I have the next slide, please? This one thing that has been consistently part of our methods is we include a site visit with SHPO for any project that's an EA or an EIS. SHPO can request a site visit for any of our projects. Obviously, our methodology for I-70 worked well. We have applied it to every project that we work on since then. It started out as a written 2-page methodology. It has grown to the current version that I'm working on drafting, something like 26 pages long, just because it's trying to explain every potential possible outcome. It's all based on trust. SHPO has to trust that we are doing a thorough and adequate professional job, that we really are out there looking for those potentially significant, exceptionally significant modern resources, that when we say we're putting feet on the ground and really looking, that we really are. And as long as we maintain that trust with SHPO, then they're willing to let us continue to use this methodology. And they like this methodology so much that they are willing to let agencies with qualified staff use this methodology for their projects. So it saves us time. It saves SHPO time reviewing resources that they don't want to review. It saves a lot of trees. And it seems to have worked out well for the state of Missouri for the last 20 years. So with that, I will turn it over to Jennifer in Texas. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Karen. All right. Good afternoon. My name is Jennifer Carpenter, and I'm a historian with TxDOT's Environmental Affairs Division. I'm here to share with you our current thinking about post-World War II neighborhoods and our efforts to develop streamlining and screening methodologies related to our work involving those places. This is all a work in progress, and it's certainly going to evolve over time as we put it into practice. So we'd love to get your feedback and ideas. Next slide, please. As our historian team thought about how we could efficiently review projects involving these neighborhoods, our discussions kept revolving around 2 thresholds: the project's potential for effects and the neighborhood's potential for eligibility. So this led us to developing an analogy of gears to drive our review process, which I'll get into a little bit later. But first, I wanted to take us on a little tour of post-World War II neighborhoods in Texas and some of the more significant ones that we've come across. So we're just going to take a quick tour and we'll look at a few. Next slide, please. First up is the Cedar Lawn Historic District. It was Galveston's first planned community, developed in the 1920s. The neighborhood boasts a variety of styles, including mid-century modern. And one of the more interesting homes in the neighborhood is the Salvatore Sam Maceo house. Sam was a successful crime boss and bootlegger, and his sprawling 1952 home was designed by E. Stewart Williams, who was also behind Frank Sinatra's Palm Springs home. Next slide, please. Here we have Carver Heights. It was Fort Worth's first neighborhood developed for African-American professionals by African-American professionals. And like many post-World War II neighborhoods, it was designed around the automobile with curvilinear streets and no sidewalks. The oldest home dates to 1947, but most development occurred between 1950 and 1965. House styles include minimal traditional, ranch, and contemporary. Next slide. Here we've got Bayou Bray, and that is League City's first modern subdivision. The construction of NASA's Johnson Space Center in nearby Clear Lake in 1961 prompted development of residential neighborhoods like this one to house employees and their families. The neighborhood was the first in the city with concrete streets and a curb and gutter stormwater system. It contains over 100 ranch and contemporary style homes on curvilinear streets. Next slide. And then our last notable post-World War II neighborhood is Austin's air-conditioned village. And as you might guess by the name, the community was developed to test centralized air conditioning systems in middle-class homes. The single-story ranch-style residences were designed with climate efficiency in mind, and construction began in 1953. The homes and the families living in them underwent a year-long series of tests. Builders were testing the different HVAC technologies, while social scientists analyzed the impacts of living in a fully air-conditioned home, which, spoiler alert, people tended to like it. The neighborhood is currently up for a National Register listing, and its nomination is notable because it argues for national level significance under criterion A. So as we've seen with this quick tour, you'll notice that most of Texas's post-war neighborhoods qualify for listing under criterion A or C. Community planning and design is the most popular area of significance, but we've got engineering, ethnic heritage, and architecture that were also used. And by looking at what's been previously determined eligible, that helps us understand what to look for in the future. Next slide. So while a handful of significant post-World War II neighborhoods are known, there are likely others out there awaiting evaluation. Given their ubiquity, however, outstanding examples of the type will probably not be the norm. So what's our methodology for addressing projects in and near post-World War II neighborhoods? As a transportation agency, our focus must be on project delivery. We know that some types of transportation projects are unlikely to have an adverse effect on these neighborhoods. So we took an approach of thinking about project effects as the first gear to drive our review process. Whether a project will have adverse effects depends on the nature of those effects relative to the neighborhood's character defining traits. So, for example, constructing a sidewalk adjacent to a neighborhood significant for its architecture or social history would not alter its ability to convey that significance. It would not have an adverse effect. However, projects that maybe widen a road through the neighborhood or remove a block of houses would have an adverse effect. Next slide. And after thinking about the character defining features of post-World War II neighborhoods and the types of project activities we typically review, we developed a list of circumstances where the project would have no adverse effect on post-World War II neighborhoods. And this would be projects whose activities require no new right-of-way and no new vertical elements like an elevated freeway, no displacements or demolition of historic age buildings, structures, objects, including minor features like walls, portals, and landscaping, and no widening of streets internal to the neighborhood. So any project that met these circumstances would not require a survey and could be quickly cleared to proceed. Next slide. But of course, not all of our projects are that simple, and there will be many that don't meet those circumstances. So in the instances where we could not say outright that a project would have no adverse effect, we shifted to second gear, or to think about potential eligibility of the neighborhood. And how to think critically but efficiently about this is key, because we don't want to spend more research time than is necessary. Given that most post-war neighborhoods fall under criterion A and or C, we developed a shorthand list of identifying characteristics that would qualify a neighborhood as significant. The C list contained typical planning and architectural considerations, where the A list considered historical trends unique to the post-war period and to Texas's post-war growth. These identifiers are by no means exhaustive, but they provide us with a good starting point for analysis. And of course, an assessment of a post-war neighborhood's integrity, or the third gear, is directly related to its potential significance. So we also developed a shorthand list of character defining features and considerations for each of the 7 aspects of integrity for our historians to use in their analysis. Next slide. And like other states that we've seen today, we're also strategizing ways that we can use GIS to supplement our understanding of post-war development and how to document our project reviews. So we've developed heat maps like the one shown here that show how Texas cities and suburban development grew over time. Maps and aerials are also very helpful in determining historic boundaries of a post-World War II neighborhood, especially as they tended to expand if they were subdivided or kept growing. Using GIS to overlay parcel and census data is another avenue we're willing to explore because it could help reveal social history trends that aren't readily apparent. All of this goes to say we're excited to continue to incorporate GIS into our documentation and review processes. We may even be able to proceed on some project reviews without traditional field survey work if there is sufficient GIS and other resources available. Next slide. And really that's it. Again, this is all a screening and streamlining effort for us that will evolve. We'd love to hear from other states. We've gotten some good feedback and ideas today already as everyone deals with this resource type and how to best review projects dealing with these neighborhoods. And with that, I'm going to say thank you for your time and attention, and I will turn it over to Sarah in Virginia to take us home.
Hi, I'm Sarah Clark. I'm the Cultural Resources Statewide History Team Leader for VDOT. And I'm going to discuss our approach for dealing with post-World War II homes. Next slide, please. VDOT began using an abbreviated survey methodology for post-World War II houses beginning in 2010. And this was prior to the completion of the NCHRP study. VDOT planned to expand the I-64 corridor between Richmond and Hampton, Virginia. The fieldwork for this project identified a large quantity of post-World War II suburbs and prompted the agency to develop a methodology that is virtually identical to the one proposed in the NCHRP report. We developed the methodology and met with a member of SHPO staff and proposed the methodology as an option, and the SHPO agreed. VDOT continues to employ this methodology on a project-to-project basis. This process has become more formalized with the inclusion of a stipulation in VDOT's federal programmatic agreement that went into effect in 2016. And this year, the PA was renewed for another 5 years. Next slide, please. Fast forward many years or a few years, and VDOT now has projects with construction dates far into the future. And the architecture surveys completed for these projects now include properties built in the late 1970s and into the 1980s. Virginia has not completed a historic context for this time period for suburbs of the late 20th century. However, I've utilized the ones that Indiana and Maryland have used and have developed, and have found both of these to be very helpful. Next slide, please. As a result of the studies previously mentioned, we know that these suburbs are the second and third waves of suburban growth. Because most of these suburbs lack consistent design or repetition of style, utilizing our original methodology, which is this one from the NCHRP study or similar to, just isn't practical. I took the time to search the database that our SHPO uses, the Department of Historic Resources, for recording architectural resources to see how many properties constructed in 1970 or later have been surveyed, and more importantly, how many of those are eligible for the National Register. I discovered that a little over 17,000 architectural resources have been surveyed. However, of that number, only 3 are eligible for the National Register. VDOT used this information to begin a dialogue with our SHPO concerning an abbreviated survey methodology for these late 20th century resources. VDOT is currently in the process of developing a survey methodology for late 20th century properties. Like our previous methodology, VDOT's intent is to still survey these resources, but not necessarily provide forms, photos, and individual mapping for each individual property. During our preliminary discussions with the SHPO, VDOT emphasized the benefits of an abbreviated deliverable for these resources. Primarily that a modification has the potential to save VDOT and the SHPO time and space. However, we're still in the early stages of this discussion. So I'll let you know how it goes. Next slide, please. And that's it from Virginia.
Thank you all for those presentations. We have plenty of time for questions. There's been a couple in the chat and in the Q&A box. Most of them have been answered, although Jennifer, there was a question for TxDOT. How have you coordinated your strategy with the Texas Historical Commission?
Sure, that is a great question. Again, we're still in kind of the early stages of planning all of this. We are definitely going to work with our SHPO to run this by them to get their feedback, any ideas they may have. They're great partners with us. We're very thankful for that. So this is, again, kind of our early thinking. We definitely want to involve SHPO and get their feedback. Some of it is kind of based on our programmatic agreement that we have with SHPO anyway, this idea of screening different project activities. So it's not too far-fetched from some of our practices we've had in place for several years now. It's just kind of taking that thinking and applying it to a specific resource type.
Thanks. Are there any other questions people want to either ask out loud? You can raise your hand or type into the Q&A box. I'll give a minute here for folks to type those in. If not, I have kind of a general question on my own end. Both in the chat and in the Q&A, there was some comment about historical associations for low income, marginalized, or minority communities that Owen Lindauer asked, and Dr. Allison Brooks in Washington noted some of the studies that have been done here. I'm just curious for other DOTs. We've been thinking about that a lot lately and wondering if cultural anthropologists might be able to find some of those kinds of associations better than, say, more traditionally trained historians, or at least some historians who are really focused on architecture. So if anyone has a comment on that or thoughts on that, I'd love to hear it. And we do have a question in the chat box from Linda Henderson. For Indiana, who funded or did the MPDF? Anthony, can you address that?
It was funded by a grant that the DHPA received. And at this point, I forget the specific background, but yeah.
Okay, thanks, Anthony. Seems like a lot of those studies are often funded by grants. Anne, I see you have your hand up.
Yes, I was actually going to respond to your question, because when we did our first suburbanization study, Prince George's County is has become one of the wealthiest African-American dominated counties in the country. And we were finding 1920s, 1930s suburban developments that were for wealthier African Americans. because of the depression, they didn't really go very far. And I was just talking to somebody this morning about some of the urban renewal projects that the county undertook in the 60s that got rid of a lot of that housing, and then 1960s housing got started. And for those of you who have been to the TRB, you may remember back in 2013, I gave a presentation about William Levitt development in Bowie, Maryland, where two federal government employees who are African American tried to buy houses from Levitt, and it caused 3 months of active picketing and protest by various groups, but Levitt refused to sell to African Americans until after Martin Luther King was killed. So all that to say that in our second context, we are coming back and doing, I think, a better job of understanding the significance of African American developments. And certainly in Baltimore City, where we have Morgan State University and Coppin University, those schools drew professors to the universities, and so developments were built, but those are within the city, and so we've got fewer African American centric developments, although we do have, I think, 3 or 4 in Prince George's County.
Thanks, Ann. Sarah, there's a question in the Q&A box for you from Kara Russell about the level of recordation you've been doing on properties. Are you able to address that?
Yes. We are taking the approach of, well, for everything up until the late 20th century, because we haven't really worked that out yet. But we are just doing a single form for an entire neighborhood. So very similar to what the other states are doing. See,
Thanks, Sarah.
Okay.
And let me just check. I think that is all the questions we have. Are there any other questions?
Hey, Scott, this is Anthony from Indiana. I just want to go back a sec to the question about identifying communities that are associated with marginalized, underrepresented groups, because I think it's an interesting question, because that's, you know, in a lot of ways, that discussion, along with this discussion that we're having today, are like the two big topics of the day for our field in a lot of ways. And I think it's worth having, especially, you know, because of the ways in which racial segregation was endemic to the development of the era, and that legacy, of course, still is with us. I think in terms of finding ways to identify neighborhoods that are associated with underrepresented, marginalized groups such as African American communities, Latinx communities, there is a growing literature in this field. This might be one area where partnerships with universities and academia could be fruitful. As mentioned by David Clark, you know, there's a lot of growing literature about the diversity of suburbs, even amongst the racial segregation that these communities face. I also think that, you know, this is where maybe the oral histories could come into play. You know, we are dealing with an era that's not that far ago, so long ago. So that kind of gets into the whole conversation of how we diversify the 106 process and bring in a greater diversity of voices from the early part of the process when we start to identify resources.
Thanks, Anthony. Those are some great points for us to consider. Holly, I see there is a question you have about, have any of these contexts included mobile home parks? I'm not sure if that's been answered yet. And you noted that the first park in the country is reported to have been established in Florida in the 1950s. So Lindsay, I don't know if you can tackle that. My impression was a lot of these contexts are really focused not on mobile home parks, but on subdivisions. But if anyone wants to correct me or add to that.
I can say that in Maryland, we certainly had mobile home parks in the 60s and probably in the 50s. Well, I know that there, the Glen L. Martin airplane factory in East Baltimore County had a mobile home park associated with it before World War II. So, I'm really kind of surprised to hear that Florida's first one came in 1960, because I lived in DeLand, Florida for a while, and I can think of lots of mobile home parks in Central Florida. I mean, there may have been a special, a fancy new development, but I don't know that it was. The 60s seems kind of late for that kind of development, but our post 1970, our 1961 to 1980 suburbanization context does take that into consideration. But
thanks, Ann. It was actually the 1950s was when
okay.
The question was. So Lindsay, do you have anything?
Sorry.
Yeah, no, that is a good point. I do believe that we are taking mobile home parks into question as part of like a planned development. I do not remember off the top of my head, but I do believe we have one mobile park or mobile home park that has been deemed eligible by our SHPO's office. I used to work in the SHPO's office, and I have vague recollection of a lot of conversation about that eligibility discussion and things like that. But I do think we'll have to take that into account, because it is a pretty significant type of development that we have here. And it's certainly something I'm going to earmark for when we start looking into these contexts as they come back to us for the phase 2 of our project.
Thanks, Lindsay. Here in Washington, we've been looking at them on their own, as mobile home parks, as opposed to, say, a broader, they're post-World War II resources, but not lumping them with housing subdivisions or commercial developments, but as their own mobile home parks. Any other questions? Oh, yikes. Sarah just noted they had a mobile home park eligible in Oregon, but it burned to the ground in last year's wildfires. I don't know that we've had one here in Washington. I've only personally been involved with one, and I think we determined that one not eligible, although I could be wrong. So Holly, if you are on and need to correct me, let me know, or Allison, if you're on. Yeah, and mobile home parks are something I think all the states are starting to look at more, and clearly some of them are eligible. And I know at least ones we've dealt with here in Washington, we've looked at like subdivisions, not so much the eligibility of every single trailer in the park, but the park as a whole, as a designed landscape. Thanks, Karen, for that note about mobile home parks in Missouri, with good books on mobile homes as resources. I may follow up with you, Karen, on that and see if I can get some of those titles and pass those on to Holly and our staff here at the SHPO.
I've started
So-
a bibliography for them.
Thank you. Yeah, you'll have to share that with us at some point. And Bob Hadlow in Oregon noted floating homes as well. And I think those of you who are on our monthly calls know that in Washington and Oregon, we're both working on floating home development nominations. So not individual floating homes, but areas that were developed essentially as floating home neighborhoods here in Washington and Oregon. So let's see. Okay, I think that's it. Unless there's any last minute questions, I will turn it over to Sigrid of Michigan DOT for closing remarks. Oh, here's one last question. Sorry, Sigrid, from Lisa about some subdivisions along the I-70 mountain corridor, looking at mountain subdivisions. I know we haven't here in Washington in particular. Anyone out there? Or Lisa, do you want to jump in to kind of give us an idea of why mountain subdivisions would be different from other subdivisions? Are they more rural? Are they outside of cities, I would guess? And Lisa, if you're there, you are muted. Okay, Hey, Lisa.
Hey, sorry, I didn't know what I was doing. Yeah, we we looked at some neighborhoods for our Floyd Hill project, which is I-70 west of Denver. So it's sort of heading out of the foothills more into, up toward the Continental Divide, but not quite. And we had a bunch of neighborhoods. There weren't really any direct effects, but we documented them and worked with and talked with our SHPO and consulting parties about them. And sort of for now are treating them as eligible because we don't have really any contextual information. We noted that they're, the lot sizes are irregular. There's not like a set plan, but they were all sort of part of a development. And there's not really any sort of context. And I, nothing urgent in this, but was kind of curious to know if other states with mountains have done any work on subdivisions, because they don't really fit the model of the post-war subdivision. And just wanted to know if there's anybody else out there who dealt with this issue.
Lisa, I think that would be a great topic for the monthly AME 60 call.
Yeah, I agree. Probably.
We could. So Tony, if you're there, take note. We'll add that for the next call.
Great, thank you.
Okay, Sigrid, I believe it is up to you to close us out. Thank you all.
Well, thanks, Scott. And I have the pleasure of closing us out for today. My name is Sigrid Bergland. I'm an architectural historian with the Michigan DOT. And I'm also the vice chair of the Cultural Resources Subcommittee. So first, I want to have a big thank you to all of those who did presentations today or who were facilitating. All of you obviously have busy schedules and you took the time to pull together information to share with us, and it was very much appreciated. To our federal partners, Advisory Council, National Park Service, and FHWA, we really appreciate always hearing your news, your thoughts, your approach to different things. It was very interesting to hear about the lack of subject matter experts that folks are running into, and also how the amorphous time frame of post-World War II, that would be something good to nail down a bit further. So appreciate all of those thoughts. Those are all things that we can chew on. Mead and Hunt, ladies, thank you very much for taking us through that case study using the existing survey and context. We appreciated hearing about that. That was very interesting. And also the preview of the commercial context. I am very much looking forward to the spring of 2023 to see when that's going to come out. So thank you very much for your time. and all of the DOTs who provided information in the lightning round. There were a lot of similar themes that I kept hearing about as all of the presentations were going along, but there were so many different approaches. I'm sure that a lot of people are taking notes and thinking this is something that I could go ahead and incorporate in my own state. Some different things that I heard were the use of GIS and how that was becoming more and more valuable for folks, how context development has been key for a lot of states, but it was interesting to hear how states are using other states' context as well. So that was interesting. How the survey methodology and forms are being used and modified to fit these particular property types. How the SHPO relationships and collaboration can make or break some of these situations. So that was also interesting to hear from various sides of that discussion. And then also we keep coming back to how to identify underrepresented communities and make sure that they are taken into account. So again, all the people who presented today, we really appreciate your help and your information that you shared. I have a huge thank you to send along to all of the AASHTO staff. We know that you have worked very hard to help all of us as we were planning this annual meeting, and then of course with all the implementation. So a huge thank you goes out to all of you. A special shout out to three particular folks, namely Jen Billow and Melissa Savage and Phil Burgoyne Allen. We really appreciate all of your behind the scenes tireless work and support as we've been going through this process, and to allow today to come off without a hitch. So again, thank you so much. And finally, to all of you who are participating, you get a big thank you, because if you weren't listening to us, we would be speaking to the ether, to the void. So thank you for your participation, and also for those of you who asked questions to tease out even more information, even more things for us to know and to share and to think about for our future use and edification. I always appreciate it when my knowledge base can grow. So I want to tell you some news from Tim Hill that next year's annual meeting, the hope is that it can be in person, at least in part. It may be a combination of in person and virtual, but the hope is that it will be in person to at least some degree. So stay tuned for more details on that. The planning is going to get started fairly soon, and next spring, summer of 2022, you should be hearing more about the annual meeting. So again, stay tuned. And until then, I bid you all farewell on behalf of the Cultural Resources Subcommittee. And depending on your time zone, have a pleasant rest of your either afternoon or evening. So bye-bye, everybody.